Good
Uh,
to see you, by the way.
Good to see you too. Yeah. We're here with Catherine Lejtenyi, who just helped me with the correct alliteration of her family name. Um, and I've got it down pat. And you and I have been talking recently. Well, you're back in Montreal.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, we're based in Montreal. You were in Berlin.
Hmm.
You've been working as a coach
Yeah.
and working both in a professional and a personal context.
Hmm.
You and I share a passion for healthcare transformation.
Yeah.
And you and I had an enlightening conversation a couple of weeks ago about what we're noticing in healthcare and how healthcare is understanding itself as it relates to this topic of trauma.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when we covered a couple of aspects of that terrain, one was the sense of where practitioners might be experiencing their own trauma and how
Yeah.
that translates in practice.
Yeah.
And the question of how we're holding space for that,
Yeah.
particularly because in their in their essence, they're healers, right? They're there in a healing profession. And some professionals may not like that word, but
Hmm. Hmm.
therapeutic, however you describe it, it's you're there to, let's say, help ease the suffering of others.
Right.
And we know in any profession where you're there to help ease the suffering of others, there's also the matter of your own suffering, which can interact with
Hmm.
what we call an intervention,
Hmm.
or let's just call it being there in a supportive capacity. There's that side of the conversation, which I
Yeah.
want to spend some time talking to you about.
Yes.
And then there's the side of the conversation of, is there something in the system
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
um, that may be contributing to unknowingly holding some of these traumatic patterns or these traumatic tendencies in place in the way it's organized, in the way that it welcomes, supports, and integrates practitioners in practice. And we're noticing that there's growing side effects in that, like more people leaving
Yeah.
healthcare practice,
Yeah.
kind of the post-COVID world of people feeling the sense of uncertainty of the system. Is the system
Yeah.
well set up to accommodate this very direct experience of suffering, which COVID was a very vivid experience for a lot of practitioners.
Yeah.
So this says something about how practitioners feel empowered, feel a sense of groundedness in their practice. And it also
Hmm.
says something about where the system does or doesn't um, make space for holding that side of practice.
Yeah.
And not even thinking of it as like a footnote, actually thinking of it as integral to its way of operating. So that's a lot of terrain to cover.
Yes.
But let's maybe start. Tell me why this matters to you. Why is this top of mind for you?
Okay, so thanks very much. That's a really good introduction to the topic, and it's given us I like that there's a lot of groundwork because it just gives us a lot to talk on, and we'll see where we get to by the end of this podcast. So that's going to be really interesting. Um, so as you point out, I am a coach and I do executive coaching and team coaching or group coaching. And the reason I got really interested in the healthcare experience, well, healthcare has always been present in my life. My mother is a doctor, my uncle is a doctor, my aunt is a doctor. So it's just medical stuff has been around all my life. I failed chemistry in high school. I have to be really transparent about that. I am not the scientist in the family. No, no, no. Um,
So you're
but
like this, you're like the side effect.
yes, I don't want to say that the stork brought me. I am maybe more my father's daughter, if anything, who my father was a revolutionary back in Hungary in 1956. So I think I've got that spirit. Like I see that there's something riddled with problems and I have a passion to change it. And so I am related. I worked in the emergency room at the Children's Hospital way back back in the day when I was at university. So sort of a side job. And you could see what was fascinating is you could see the passion of the doctors. And then you could see the different types of people who worked in the medical field, especially because it was pediatricians. Some of them were real A-type personalities, just here's the disease, here's what you have to do to treat it, call endocrinology or whatever, whoever is there. And other doctors who go into it much more with their hearts and they're dealing with the person as a whole. So there's really a wide variety of people who go into medicine, as you know.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting. And also the experience in Germany for me was quite eye-opening because Germany has broadly speaking, has two types of health insurance. They have the public health insurance and the private health insurance. And as an expat, I had private health insurance and very different types of medical care were covered by insurance that isn't covered in Canada. So some forms of psychotherapy are covered by health insurance. Osteopathy will be covered by health insurance. Some forms of naturopathy or acupuncture. So it depends on what company you're with. Sometimes you'll need a medical prescription. Sometimes you can just go in and then your health insurance will cover it. But there's a very broader understanding of care than there is here.
Right.
So I find in Canada, we're really back into that dichotomy of, either you're healthy and you're asymptomatic and you get on with your life, or you have an illness and you get put into the medical system and you go through that and sort of be grateful for what you get. Now, there is a lot to be grateful for because Western medicine is miraculous. My 84-year-old mother just had a knee replacement surgery, and she was in and out the same day. And you can be sure 4 days later, she's like, time to climb the stairs and see if I can do it. This is amazing.
Sure.
Right? But there are blind spots as well. And I really want to talk about the blind spots. And I think there are blind spots, as you mentioned, with doctors, with the training they get, with the way they're encouraged to deal with their own stuff. And that, of course, moves into how they deal with patients.
Yeah. I wonder, as you were talking, it occurred to me that I wonder is there something in the way we socialize physicians, the language of medical, that disconnects practitioners from the fuller range of their experience? This idea that the medium and the metaphor are deeply entwined, as Neil Postman said. It's like the metaphor of medical can be both, as you said, a miraculous world,
Right.
open up this, the depth of the science and the curiosity and the intelligence of human beings that create all of these life-saving procedures and treatments. It's
Yeah.
monumental. I have plenty of friends who are alive today because they've got access to treatment. But every blessing has its curse.
Yeah.
And the curse, and they're not, and I want to be careful in this conversation that we're not trying to polarize these worlds. What we're saying is sometimes being so immersed in one way of languaging healthcare can turn a blind eye to a whole other universe of opportunity.
That's
So
right.
we're not saying this is not opportune. It is.
Yes.
We're saying there's a larger world of opportunity that somehow the metaphor is confining us in. And what we're noticing now, although I think it was latent forever, is this world that we're languaging is starting to feel a little like a Tower of Babel. Like it's confusing and
It's confusing. Okay.
we're not speaking the same language anymore. And more conflict is arising. And we're not clear where we're really going anymore. And we're starting to hit the edges of that metaphor and bumping into those walls. And COVID was like, it's like a crash test dummy. It was ramming into the wall of this way of making sense. So what we're saying is that every way of making sense is both um, filled with space for creative opportunity, and it's also bound by
Yeah.
that way of making sense. And are we ready to push the frontiers? Is it
Yeah.
necessary that we push the frontiers? Given what we now know about health, um, getting healing,
Yeah.
well-being, I think this is kind of what we're up to. So I try to caution in these conversations, people are listening, is there's nothing in this dialogue that's about anti anything. We're not anti medical. We're not anti medical practice.
Yeah.
We're simply trying to understand what opportunities and what constraints it invites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I see it. I see the whole a very wide range of constraint. So yeah, and I want to sort of underscore what you said. This is not about blame. This is not about polarizing or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I think we should, there are bad faith players, but let's undertake this in a spirit of good faith and just assume that everyone is acting in good faith. Like that's the level. And we can deal with bad faith players at another discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think what we're working towards ideally would be a broadening of healthcare. So instead of dealing with disease, that you say, well, what is the biographical situation that you are presenting with your disease with, right? So, and this is, I mean, I have to say, one of the reasons that I'm passionate about this topic is that I have been following Dr. Gabor Mate for the past 7 or 8 years. I came across him once I think it was on Facebook. I've had some addicts in my life, various acquaintances, friends, whatever, and I saw a video of his with the undertitle, A Different Way of Looking at Addiction.
Mm.
And so Gabor Mate, as some of you know, some of you might not know this, talks a lot about addiction. He also talks about chronic illness and how the system basically fails to address the biographical roots and factors that contribute to the onset of chronic illness. And he's careful to say they don't cause chronic illness, but they contribute to the onset. And so for me, broadening the discussion on healthcare really just means, well, how can we address those other biographical issues?
Yeah, so that's a very good lead in to the two sides of the trauma conversation.
Yeah,
It opens me to thinking of it as what's the biographical orientation of the practitioner?
right. Yeah.
What story are they holding?
What story? Yeah.
Yeah, that he's either serving
Hmm.
or maybe putting them in a position of vulnerability relative to practice.
Yeah.
And then, interestingly enough, what story is the system holding? What's the biography of the collective we, the thing we call the system, that it's telling itself about healthcare, that it might be inducing a kind of systemic trauma
Mm.
that's making it difficult for there to be a sense of that's creating a kind of chronicity
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
to, to extend the metaphor, a kind of
Yeah.
chronic illness
Yeah.
in continually bumping into the same problems over and over again. Um, so why don't we build on that? Let's
Sure.
extend that metaphor and speak to this idea of story and biography, and what in technical terms, Gabor and others call this kind of biopsychosocial model, this
Yeah.
larger
Yeah.
picture portrait
Yeah.
of this experience I call my life, that has all of these interwoven tentacles that either can be freeing in their release or can be like a knotted octopus.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I
that goes
mean,
flailing in the water.
well, that's it. So that it's a huge, 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 huge topic because just as a human being is not just, a body and a mind and they're separate, and instead they're biopsychosocial beings. The system itself is really complex and there are so many factors that are going into it. So if you look at a doctor, I mean, a typical doctor, and I've seen a lot of them, and is there such a thing as a typical doctor? Let's sort of park that question because
We'll just hold it as a caricature for the sake of.
yeah, exactly. And we'll see if it resonates. I mean, I think a lot of people are going through a system, so a medical system in a society that is based on not repressing what you've gone through emotionally in order to function and be as successful as possible in a system that values performance over well-being.
Yeah, and I think and I want to add in medical, I think performance, it's not a word I hear often in medical, but I'm sure it's present in the consciousness. But let's actually know it. I'd say it seems to show up more as like I don't have a nicer word than this, but elitism in the sense of like being the best at your craft.
Right.
So it's like I'm the best doctor, and this is also nurtured in school, right? Like it's a very competitive environment. And then
Exactly.
the other one I would add is not just the sense of when you said performance, it triggered a word for me. So there's also the question of esteem, being held in
Yeah.
high regard.
Mhm.
And the other one is scientism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the sense of
Yeah.
like the integrity of being um, objectively true all the time.
Yeah.
And
Objectively correct. Yeah.
objectively correct. Yeah,
Yeah. Of
objectively correct. And I've spoken to physicians who say there's interphysician conflict
course there
because
is.
some physicians see themselves as their science, my science,
Yeah.
is more correct than your science. So,
Yeah.
like, you're an anesthesiologist. Your science is lesser science than my
That's
science.
right. Oh, right. Yeah.
Um, so there is that dynamic. I just wanted to tease that out a little bit because I thought it was important as you were speaking to just pull that apart a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, because doctors have high status. Why do they have high status in our society? Well, they provide an incredibly important service. So you've had friends, I've had friends, we've both been in a situation where we wouldn't be here today were it not for our wonderful doctors.
Yeah.
Um, but it gets problematic when they're seen as the gatekeepers of knowledge, of truth, of health, of well-being, of what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to live, because they have the access to that empirical knowledge. And there's, you know, whenever there's arguments made for anti-elitism is like, well, would you want just any Joe Schmo performing your cardiac surgeries? No, I know, but that's not the point.
It's also like a sliver of the point in the sense of saying,
Right.
yes, of course, there are interventions in healthcare that require certain precise technical skill. I want
Yeah,
the most skilled surgeon in the world. But there's so much in between, the kind of warm spaces in between that require a certain adeptness at complexity that are not discrete tasks. Actually, a lot of it is about that.
that's right.
And we have to be able to hold that difference.
So I think that's really important what you're saying, because so what I wanted just to a little bit finish the point that I was making is that with the status that doctors have, and as you say, the elitism or the hierarchy, really that's mirroring the society as a whole. That no matter what kind of profession, what walk of life, we're talking about hierarchy. And the most important thing is the hierarchy. Are you a university lecturer or are you a tenured professor?
Hmm.
Are you a tenured professor at Boston University or at Harvard? All of that makes a difference. It's not really a question of what you know, how you speak, how you interact with people, how you transfer knowledge. It's, oh, do you have the status? And so this question of what is your standing in society, it gets transferred also to the medical system. And I know at certain hospitals, I mean, the hierarchy between doctors and nurses is really strict.
Yeah.
That if a nurse feels a patient needs a certain treatment, she has to speak to the head nurse, who then asks the doctor, can nurse A administer this treatment?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're in a very fossilized, it's very conventional structure of hierarchy and elitism. And the question is, where does the patient fit into that hierarchy?
Yeah, that's a very pressing question that's being explored right now because we are seeing this shift in healthcare from system centric,
Yeah.
patient centric. I would argue that I'm not sure the system is ready for this move because it's not it's being kind of marketed as a procedural change. It's not a procedural change. It's actually a sense-making change. The
Okay.
procedures are it's a different mindset. And when you take physicians and healthcare practitioners who have been socialized in a more expert centric, system
Yeah.
centric mindset and try to say to them, guess what? The people, patients in front of you, they're also experts, and we need to get to know what they want, what they're wishing for, what they need and desire. Your rational mind says, that makes sense, or that
Mhm.
sounds good,
Yeah.
or but really it's a shift in perspective. So we have to be able to accommodate that. So there is this shift happening, but you're right. In the classic hierarchy, patients were kind of like um, somewhere lower in the totem pole.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, if you go to the emergency room, you get the doctor that you're assigned, and it's a sort of beggars can't be choosers scenario,
For sure.
you
For
know?
sure. For sure.
Um,
And patients
so
are often very intimidated.
oh sure.
I felt it. I'm someone who works in healthcare and who's a strong advocate for voice and
Yeah.
choosing and agency. And you're in front of a physician, they're about to perform surgery on a loved one. And what's in the back of
Yeah.
your mind? Don't piss this person off.
Yeah, right. Sure.
Self censor. And this surgery is an extreme example, but I think this happens moment to moment with lots of patients who defer both in the expert stance, but also out of fear
Yeah.
and don't feel a sense of that agency, don't feel a sense, they don't question, they don't interrogate. They
Yeah.
actually forget that we're talking about the experience of their health,
And their bodies.
their bodies, their minds, their lives, that whole biopsychosocial universe,
Yeah.
their fears, their traumas, their concerns. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's shifting. We're starting to intuit and understand the value of integrating that. I'm not sure why we couldn't
I know.
quite hook onto that before. Like patients are subjects, like they have subjectivity. We didn't notice
Yeah.
that. We're only noticing that now, but every dog has their day. Um, but you're right. Yeah, still a sense of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Who holds the knowledge? Who's the holder of the knowledge?
Yeah.
Um, I would suggest that in the context of talking about trauma, I think that's actually a traumatizing experience.
For
And
sure.
we don't think of it that way. I was talking to my uncle who was an emergency physician and then later went on to do an ICU physician and later went on to do consulting work. And he said, when I started my career, I was an expert.
Hmm.
And no matter what someone asked me, I would answer.
Okay.
And I felt the pressure to answer.
Right.
I needed to have.
Right.
And then later in my career, and really more at the tail end, it only then became comfortable for him to say, I don't know.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. I can corroborate that experience. Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
all I'm
is it
gonna say.
traumatizing to be like, it's an interesting question. Is it traumatizing to be under a constant strain to be an expert?
Hmm. So I mean, traumatizing is such a big word, and it's probably different for different people. But I would say, I mean, if we're looking at, for lack of a better word, a hierarchical society that produces hierarchical structures, then the question is, well, how do you become top dog? And everyone wants to become top dog in a hierarchical structure. Well, I can assure you, you don't go to work and complain about your husband or your wife, or tell people that your kids are getting really shitty grades at school.
Right. There's a sense of the importance of your infallibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And and I think there's a truth to the insight that how you treat other people is how you treat yourself. And I think if you're one of these top dog doctors and you go around telling everyone like I'm top dog, and you might have reached a certain position in your department, etc. But what's that pressure? I mean, in German, they would say the sword of Damocles, like there must be this really, the guillotine on your hair's ends of I cannot lose this position. I have to, and I'll use the word again, perform. I think again in German that would be more common, leisten. You have to produce, you have to show, you have to prove yourself over and over again. There's no rest, there's no room for mistake. And for sure, I mean, if you're a cardiac surgeon, no, not really. So the pressure is on. And I think doctors don't really get support. They don't have meetings, support group meetings where they can say, wow, like last week was really hard. This happened. I wasn't sure.
I
I
would be,
think they,
would it be interesting to walk down the hallway of a hospital and there's a sign on the door that says physician support group? I think it would be incomprehensible.
exactly. Exactly. And what would you think? Like, oh, there are incompetent doctors who work in this hospital. So I think that's happening. And so the more pressure they feel, the more that they are holding things back for themselves, the more they're projecting the image of infallibility and have to uphold the structure that promises that they are infallible.
Yeah, and there's also the conditioning of, I think it's embedded in the language of the clinical objectivity, and
Yeah,
the that I think has taken on a very odd form. This idea
yeah,
of non-transference, of a certain kind of distance, that's been translated, I think, as a sometimes shows up as a lack of empathy.
yeah,
Like there's so
right,
much distance. Like we've actually we threw out the empathy baby with the bathwater.
right, yeah,
Because empathy requires a certain, well, I would say a very high level of self-awareness.
sure,
Because it's growing from a place of deep compassion. It's very hard to find deep compassion if you have a low level of self-compassion.
yeah,
Um, that's, I think, another side effect of the expert stance, the clinical objectivity, the over scientism, the scientific materialism, which is like everything is looked at through a microscope.
yeah,
That's the operating metaphor, even though
yeah,
that from a pure quantum perspective, none of that is actually true, but there's still that's the operating metaphor.
mhm, mhm,
That's the language of healthcare. That's how we language healthcare, which is right to your point. Like probably wouldn't see a physician support group being facilitated in a hospital environment because that would be quite gooey
yeah.
and
Oh,
maybe a
good.
little bit messy. Yeah, terrible. Like it would be a bit of a bloody mess.
Yeah,
It wouldn't be surgical.
that's right. Yeah,
So it's interesting, like, and then people like Gabor come around, and even people like Brene Brown and others who start talking about
yeah,
these shadowy, deep, vulnerable places inside of us that are moment to moment affecting how we experience the world, how we experience ourselves, how disease is correlated to disease in the sense of like the sense of the inflammation of the trauma and how that's inflaming our lives. And of course, our
mhm,
bodies can't separate out the body from the mind. So the
yeah,
body, plays catch up with that trauma.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I wonder in that environment how you facilitate a conversation with healthcare practitioners to not only make it okay for them to attune to their own experience,
Yeah.
to grow beyond the left side of the mind, that hyper rational, hypo dissecting, and to step into, as Ian McGilchrist says, the right side of the mind that's much more relational and in a way much more wise
Yeah.
and which has a much larger macro perspective on things. How you invite that, um, and why it's necessary to invite that, and how in fact does that restore a sense of joyfulness back into practice at a time
Hmm.
where it seems like the joy is being sucked out of
Yeah.
healthcare.
Yeah.
which I sometimes call care, the care in healthcare, the nurturing, the softness, the empathy, all of those. What's your sense of that? How do you start to have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming as a coach, and I've been also lately influenced by Eric from the psychoanalyst. Yeah, and so I sort of call myself a humanistic coach.
Mhm.
And what I would love to do is create coaching spaces for doctors where they can just open up and talk about things, and then have an approach where you ask them, in this coaching sense of asking powerful questions, what could be different? Can you imagine what the experience for the patient was like at that moment?
Mhm.
So to a little bit through the coach's own empathy, and a little bit elicit the empathy in the doctor. And that also means having empathy first and foremost with the doctor, with what they've gone through.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
meet the doctor, you meet, as you meet the doctor, you meet the client where they're at. So
Mhm.
you don't have to pour in empathy if they're like, hey, I'm a super competent doctor,
Right.
I'm doing this because I don't like whatever, it might be useful. And okay, so you sort of deconstruct whatever is going on if need be,
Mhm.
and then you open up that empathic space. And I think that could be really, really useful for doctors. The same thing about creating group experiences. We don't have to have the sign on the door that this is the support group, but just to create a space, and it doesn't have to be immediately, touchy feely. It can be a discussion of what are the frustrations, what's going on, what is working, what is not working. And then go from there, again, asking those powerful questions. And you said this, connecting with the right mind, the right brain, the right side of the brain, and accessing that wisdom. And I do believe that everyone is carrying around an immense amount of wisdom. And
Mm.
it's about connecting.
Yeah, I love connecting is huge because like coming back to the craft of
Yeah.
connecting.
Yes. Yes. And
So
I
if you're a physician, I mean, look, there are some practicing healthcare professionals who have limited contact with clients, but the vast majority have some
yeah,
contact with clients. That
yeah,
means you're in the craft of connecting.
yeah,
So yes, you'll say knowledge brokering and transmitting information and diagnosing. Yeah, that's all true. That's just what you do.
yeah.
Those are things that you perform. It's like saying a carpenter, hits nails into wood. That's
Right.
true. You want
Yeah.
to be able to know how to do that. But what they're really doing is building the home of people's dreams.
Yes. Yes.
And when they lose sight of that, I would argue they lose sight of their craft and maybe also to become dispassionate about their work because it just becomes about hitting nails into wood, which, as we could probably imagine, would only be so stimulating for so long.
Mm.
And what I'm noticing in healthcare, in the craft of healthcare, is the craft has been lost in a way, the care of the craft, the care
Yeah.
of connection.
Yeah.
And I'm not that, again, like anytime we say this, it's not about laying blame. I don't think there's a group of physicians sitting in a corner rubbing their hands saying, how do we strip care out of healthcare? It's a because cultures are co-created. The culture doesn't, it's not a thing in a room that, is it's not a caged lion.
Yeah.
It's being co-created. And so how do you come back to the sense of the craft of connection?
That's so interesting that you bring this up, because as I was thinking about it, about, talking with you, I was thinking, okay, the patient doctor interface. And then I thought we really need to move away from that, because it means that there are two sides,
Yeah.
right? There's the patient and there's the doctor, and they're coming, and, maybe it's contentious, maybe it works. And and I think we need to move towards interconnectedness.
Yeah, and I would say it is loaded with assumptions. Like
Yeah.
it is like you could not have, I can't think of too many relations. I mean, another one is like police officer citizen. That's also loaded,
Right. Yes.
which is why a lot of people are afraid of the police
Yeah.
because it's like they're imbued with very discrete functions that feel like at odds with each other. Even though the police are there to protect the public, which is
Exactly.
ironic, because most people are scared shitless of the police.
For sure.
I'd say in the healthcare professional client relationship, there are a lot of pre-baked assumptions that predefine roles, predefine how that experience is going to happen,
Definitely.
and inhibit connection.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find it really unfortunate that there isn't more discussion from, let's say, humanistic doctors who go out and educate people, like, this is what's happening, lay people. I don't understand much about medicine. As I said, I failed chemistry, boohoo. Um, but I trust my mother, wouldn't you know it? I trust my uncle and my aunt. So for me, the medical system is something um, foreign. It's something other that I can use, but I go with it because of my family background with a lot of trust and a lot of faith. And I'm like, I'm sure they know what they're doing. And I've overheard conversations like, oh, they sound like they're pretty, you know, good faith workers, let's say. But a lot of people don't have that access at all. And so, you're going there and you're almost expecting a magical process and you have no input into that experience at all.
I would say that the it underserves healthcare to be in that kind of procedural mindset, because being in a procedural mindset as a client means that you think everything is going to be a linear process.
Right.
A will cause B, will cause C. And of course, anyone who's been a patient
Yeah.
knows that that looks nothing like that.
Yeah.
Very rarely does it actually have a very clear sequence. It's quite curvaceous, it's
Yes.
complex, it didn't quite happen the way we thought. Now there's a this thing, there's a that problem, there's an adjunct problem, you have to go see that person. So in a way, it's also the assumptions baked into that relationship
Yeah.
not only um, create a kind of disconnection for practitioners, but I think befuddle clients who are
Yeah.
being sold really false goods, because it
Well,
really doesn't take the form of that. It really takes the form of that, unless you have a very discrete health problem. But if it's moving anywhere into the territory of the complex, the chronic,
mm,
if you think this is going to be a linear process, a causal
right.
process, highly unlikely that's going to be the case.
And what's interesting is that with that attitude, with that mindset, is you deter people from taking agency.
Yeah.
And patient agency is such an, because God forbid a patient research their symptoms on the internet. And I get it. Like, I once thought I must have tongue cancer. And I called my mother and I'm like, Mom, I have pustules on the back of my tongue. I think and she said, yeah, those are your taste buds.
Diagnosis taste buds.
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, there's a lot of
What
danger.
about the yeah, so the danger, so that's a good example. So it's like, so people will use that as proof about why you need experts.
Yeah,
Like Catherine's not very good at diagnosing tongue cancer, clearly, or at
it's
chemistry.
not.
Um, but what Catherine is good at, and what really matters in
Yeah.
Catherine's health experience, is she's extremely curious.
Right.
She's extremely self-reflective. A sense of agency and autonomy and self-directed action are important to Catherine.
Yeah.
Guess what? Those are all very important to better health outcomes. So while Catherine might be terrible at diagnosing tongue cancer, she's really, really good at all those other things. And that
Yeah.
all needs to be celebrated. So again, this is where we end also things. But the tendency has been, well, the average person is just terrible at really diagnosing their health.
Yeah.
Translation, please leave your health to us.
That's right.
That's not the right formula.
That
That's not an accurate sequence, logical sequence.
no.
Um,
Well,
it's been a little missed. That's a
especially,
classic expert's error. The expert's
totally.
error is either or. It's like either you're an expert or you're not.
Yeah.
And in practice, that's not true.
Yeah. Well, and this also highlights something else. Did you know, a therapist friend told this to me, a male therapist. He said that women therapists psychotherapists are more successful because they're naturally empathic.
Mm.
Now, so I don't like the gender divide, whatever, But what's clear is that empathy is part of the healing process,
Yeah.
compassion, connection.
Yeah.
And so, and this was one of Gabor Mate's main arguments, especially when it comes to breast cancer in women, that the mortality rate spikes when a woman is stressed and emotionally isolated.
Yeah.
Just the research has shown that again and again. And I think you can probably expand that to include other diseases, other disabilities, and things like this.
Yeah. I'd say there is definitely a correlation, and he speaks of it quite a bit in any kind of alienating,
Yeah,
suppressing. Well, I'll come back to this sense of disconnection when one is cut off from the flow of one's experience of this
yeah,
complex interwoven system. It's like
yeah,
cutting off part of the forest. Things start, it sets off a process where, yeah, things become inflamed. They become disordered
yeah,
because you were feeling disordered.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the two things when as I was thinking about at this, and I think about it a lot, um, to me, it's so strange that one would even say the sentence, let's rehumanize the medical system.
I kind of half laugh when we talk at people before patients about humanizing healthcare because it sounds like restoring oxygen to breathing.
Yeah, right?
Well, it's
Right?
also this, I mean, there's all these it's like organic food. Like there's all these funny things we say that they're both they're tragically funny. Yeah,
Yeah,
so you're right. Humanizing healthcare.
yeah,
Healthcare about the health of humans and about suffering. What's more human than that? There doesn't get
exactly.
human than that. That's like the epitome of human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, it just seems culturally there's been this sort of race between, what empirical science can accomplish, and therefore you have to bracket out the messy emotions, which don't help. And let's face it, empirical science, medical science, they've accomplished a lot. But then, you have this overtaking of the social sciences, the humanities. Well, what about the human experience that falls outside of rational categories? And then somehow we have to create a bridge between the two,
Yeah.
I think. And I think that that's about education and empowerment on both sides.
And restoring the value of creativity, because what drove all of those scientific innovations wasn't science.
Right.
Science
Okay.
is not a thing. Like, where is science? The science is not
Mhm.
coming for dinner tonight. It's curiosity, it's human curiosity,
Yeah.
desire to understand, to become aware of, to inquire into, which is a very human act.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so restoring the value of curiosity and connection,
Yeah.
which are the lifeblood, they're the DNA of healthcare. And in the deference to the procedure and the roteness and the expert stance, um, we've elevated the expert above all of those other things that
Mhm.
actually birth the expert, which is
Mm.
the creativity, the curiosity, and the connection. And
Yeah.
so we're trying to like restore the balance here
Yeah.
in a system that feels out of balance. And now in being out of balance is in this kind of traumatic state.
Yeah.
I think COVID was that,
Oh, yeah.
like the sense of powerlessness
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
overwhelmed the healthcare system. And the healthcare system, from a collective nervous system perspective, said, "What do we do with this?
Yeah.
Like, how do we handle this? It's like we're out of control here."
Yeah.
And there was
Yeah.
nothing, yeah, nothing in that psychology that could say, we can be with this complexity, we can be with this ambiguity, we can be with this overwhelming sense of suffering because we have a connected, curious, caring culture. That's
Yes.
the backbone of our work. And they realized when they turned around, there was no backbone.
Mm.
It was not there to lean on.
Yeah. That's yeah.
And I think what we're experiencing now is noticing that we don't have this caring net to just fall into when we need to fall into it. And the expert stance is not enough to meet the real deep needs of healthcare, which include the needs of healthcare practitioners, because they're not automatons. They're not robots.
No,
I don't care how
no.
expert they are. They're feeling, thinking, sensing, perceiving,
Yep.
emoting beings.
Yep.
And anything they've developed to cope with a disconnected culture are really maladaptive ways of being in front of human suffering.
Mm.
And I say that it's a blanket statement, but I say that with a lot of confidence that,
Hmm.
and what we're trying to do is to say, how do we integrate those experiences? Actually, how do those experiences enrich the craft of healthcare?
Which experiences do you mean?
The ones that when we're faced with like very profound human suffering,
Yeah.
including our own suffering and including the suffering that is elicited in being in front of
Yeah.
someone who is suffering.
Yeah. I mean, I think the phrase that's been going through my mind as you've been speaking is COVID was a major cock up. Like this is a separate conversation because there's so much to say about it. But I think that was a really apt metaphor that there was no backbone to lean on. I think that's just really, it really works. I think it exposed a lot of the fault lines that have been underlying things for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, I think there are also so many systemic problems that have been shown, and I don't think there are solutions coming from the powers that be. And I don't want to get into a really big political discussion, although one could be had, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
No, for sure. It's part of the matrix of the,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a socio-political.
And a lack of funding. I mean, it's also there's just that.
Yeah, some people, I mean, that's an interesting conversation of itself. Like, is there a shortage of money in healthcare? Like, it doesn't appear to be a shortage of money in healthcare, but there does seem to be a pattern in how healthcare money is spent.
Yeah.
And the question is it enhancing the craft of healthcare
Yeah.
or not? And the sense of that is that it's not enhancing the craft of healthcare. Um, yeah, there is the most difficult part, I think, about being in a traumatic experience,
Mm, hmm. Hmm.
whether it's as an individual or as kind of the systems trauma, is trying to break through the veneer of the trauma. Because the trauma is both, let's say, the origin of the tension and also the thing that we also might be leaning on. It becomes both
Yeah.
the problem
Right.
and the way of making sense of something. And sometimes we even double down
Sure. Yeah.
on, it's like being an expert and having this pressure to perform all the time and to be all knowing and to be all solving and to be all fixing.
Yeah.
When I run into the sense of the vulnerability that shows up, like a COVID, watch this, I'm going to double down on being an expert.
Yeah.
Because that's both, it's both the safety blanket
Yes.
and the thing that is suffocating the life out of you.
It's
Um,
Yeah. And also I'm going to vilify everyone who disagrees with my expertise.
yeah, there's that happening as well. And I think we see this a bit in the polarization of the world of wellness and in the world of medical.
Yeah.
And while they're starting to um, have better world relations,
Yeah. Yeah.
relations for wellness and medical, there still is this idea that one is anti-science, one is pro-science,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. And so there's this polarization, right? Is that people who don't understand, for example, don't understand vaccination are just, and so they express their skepticism, which is, they have the right to express skepticism. They get
In fact, I
thrown.
think we should be encouraging it. Isn't that
Yeah.
a scientific way? Like, you have a hypothesis,
Yeah.
and we're trying to understand the truthfulness of that hypothesis.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what you're saying is, I have a hypothesis. It's absolutely 100% true. That's not science. That's dogma.
Well, indeed. I mean, it does begin to sound quite authoritarian.
Yeah, and there was a lot of that going on during COVID.
There was.
And again, we took a very either or mindset. Either you're pro-vaccine or you're anti-vaccine. God forbid you should ask any questions. I think it
Yeah.
was emblematic actually of the that disconnection in healthcare. I think it was a perfect metaphor for what often goes on in healthcare, which is
Yeah.
what healthcare decides.
Yes.
Definition is absolutely right.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that's true. It's right until it's not right. That's
Yeah.
science. It's
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
not right, but implicit in its rightness is its not rightness.
Yeah.
Like
So how do you create?
Cartesian theory is right,
Yeah.
so quantum theory rolls around and says a lot of
Yeah.
things about Cartesian theory were not quite true.
Yeah. Oops.
Sorry, sorry,
Yeah.
we got that wrong. And we learned about this post. This is not anti-vaccine. We learned about this at the tail end of COVID. Some things we were saying about the vaccine weren't true.
Yeah.
We thought they were true.
Yeah.
The problem wasn't we thought that they were true. The problem was that we were insisting they were true. And anyone who suggested that maybe they weren't true, or they were concerned that they might not be true because it could have a direct impact on their health, were considered to be outliers, outlaws, anti-society.
Yeah.
You just want.
Whack. I mean, it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this real. I mean, we're going a bit off topic because
I,
there's. It's all connected. It's all connected.
it's the trauma of being the expert. The trauma is not just the sense of I'm living embroiled in a feeling of disconnection, dysregulation. It's also sometimes how it shows up in the affirmative, the
Sure.
over
Sure.
exaggeration, the
Yeah.
over insistence, the over dogma, right? So it's like it's the insecure person's
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
bullying quality. That's
Yeah.
the affirmation of the insecurity. I'm using the word affirmation metaphorically here, but that's
Yeah.
how they affirm the trauma. And what we do to healthcare professionals is we
To
say,
reinforce it. I mean, you mean.
yeah, we
Yeah.
reinforce it. Exactly. We're
Yeah.
going to train you to be experts for 10 years. You better damn well be experts. And we want you to double down on that. We want you to be all knowing. We want you to be omniscient. And God forbid when you don't know, or stop being curious, or stop feeling connected, or
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
double down on that, it creates a cascade of other problems in both its dysregulated form and in its reinforced form.
Absolutely. I think so. Let me just gather my thoughts for a second.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Uh, this need to be an expert is so uh, at the core of empirical epistemology, right? Of how you know things. And we know things by their empirical reality, their empirical truth, and the fact that I can check it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you get to the top of that, the higher you get, the better you are at finding the empirical truth. And that means, you're just looking at whatever under the microscope, and you're discovering things in your isolation about the object that you have under examination. And so there is this real sense of mastery, and there is this objectification of the thing the thing or person, as the case may be, that you're examining. And
But
that is
person as object, because that's
person as
important.
object.
That's important to note. That's different than person as subject as
I
well.
know. Yeah. And so that has been, for better or worse, the history of Western thought, since the Greeks almost. And what I would like to propose is that maybe we can start thinking not more in a sense of observing the object, but of relating to it.
Mhm.
So we need not only emotional intelligence, we need relational intelligence.
Yeah, and we can both observe objectively something that is going on.
Yeah,
We can relate intersubjectively and subjectively to what is going on.
exactly.
And in the absence of that part two, all the disconnection becomes the way of life. in practice.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So the way, exactly, the way that you studied, the way that you have trained, then gets translates into the way you relate to the human beings.
Yeah. Well, this is how you've been languaging your experience, right?
Yeah,
It's like, I mean, think about it. You're learning about people in textbooks, under
yeah,
microscopes,
yeah.
in experiments.
Cutting them up, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is while both very important, also creates a language for how you're languaging your world, and then not surprisingly, you show up with that language in the world, even when the world is saying to you, it's much messier than that.
Yeah, it's
When your
much
patients
messier.
say, I don't think so, I don't know, I don't want to, that's not exactly what I want to do,
Yeah.
I'm feeling this, you're saying that, it's like, none of that was in the textbook.
No.
What chapter was that again?
Yeah,
And that's how the world shows up.
absolutely.
Like when COVID showed up, where was the chapter on COVID?
Where was the chapter on COVID?
And everyone was like, we have no language for this.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to talk more about COVID. I think it's something we're not doing enough of.
Well, I think we were trying to get to the heart of COVID. Obviously, was an experience, and it was a devastating experience for everyone. So I'm not reducing it by saying this, but it was an
Yeah,
apt metaphor.
yeah,
What what we've seeded into healthcare that is now coming to roost, that is now
yeah, yeah, yeah.
blossoming is not the right word, but that is kind of
Bearing its evil fruit.
yeah, in the garden of healthcare, and is in part contributing to the exodus, is in part
Yes.
contributing to the dissatisfaction, is in part people practicing under the auspices of feeling a sense of disconnection in their practice.
I
And
think there's a
it's
dark cloud. Yeah. I think there's a dark cloud from COVID.
definitely
In
a dark cloud. And it was, it was in the atmosphere for a long
Yeah,
time. Um, and if we're going to make healthcare a space, a sanctuary,
yeah.
everyone,
Yeah.
a
That's a
sanctuary.
nice word. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sanctuary.
Yeah.
It's become sanitized, and it's no longer a sanctuary.
Yeah.
If we can restore the sense of its sanctity, it means that we need to do that for people impacted by a health issue, and it means that we absolutely need to do that for people working in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's pick up. I'm conscious of the time, but
Yeah.
maybe you and I can schedule more time to keep talking about this,
Yes.
build on this. Is that good?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.